"Sir, if you sign that, you lose everything." The words didn't echo. They landed, heavy and precise, like something that had been waiting for the exact second to exist. The boardroom froze in place, not dramatically, not loudly, but in the quiet, unsettling way that makes people suddenly aware of their own breathing. 12 executives sat around a 40-foot glass table, the skyline of Manhattan stretching behind them in cold blue light. And at the head of it all, Richard Caldwell, worth $9 billion by last quarter's estimate, held a black Montblanc pinned just inches above the final signature line. He didn't look up right away. He didn't have to. Men like him weren't interrupted, especially not by someone like her. Ava Johnson stood near the far end of the table, shoulders squared but hands still at her sides, her badge catching the overhead light just enough to read Facility Support. Someone shifted in their leather chair. Another let out a quiet, disbelieving chuckle. "Did she just?" a voice murmured, not even finishing the sentence. Ava felt the weight of every eye in the room, the kind that didn't just look at you but measured you, reduced you, placed you neatly into a category you weren't supposed to escape from. She could feel the hum of the air conditioning, steady and indifferent, brushing cool against her skin, hear the faint ticking of the wall clock that suddenly sounded louder than it had all morning. Richard's pen hovered, unmoving. He finally leaned back slightly, not fully, just enough to shift the angle of power, his gaze sliding toward her with slow, controlled curiosity. It wasn't anger. Not yet. It was something colder. "Do you know where you are?" one of the senior partners asked, his tone polished but edged with disbelief. A few smiles flickered around the table, tight and amused. Ava didn't respond to him. Her eyes stayed on the contract in front of Richard, on the exact line where the ink was supposed to seal a decision worth hundreds of millions of dollars. 8 hours earlier, she had been wiping fingerprints off this same glass table, moving quietly between chairs no one expected her to sit in, her reflection faint beneath the city's reflection above. That was how it always worked. People like her moved through spaces like shadows, present but unseen, necessary but never considered. Until something didn't sit right. Until a page left slightly open in the copier tray pulled her attention just enough to pause. Until a single clause, buried deep in legal language designed to blur meaning, revealed something else entirely. Now she stood in the middle of a room she was never meant to speak in, feeling the air thicken with judgment, with doubt, with the unspoken assumption that she had already overstepped. Richard tapped the pen once against the paper, a soft sound that cut through the silence like a metronome resetting the room's rhythm. His jaw tightened just slightly, the kind of movement only someone watching closely would catch. Ava didn't move, didn't lower her gaze, didn't apologize. The skyline behind him glowed faintly as clouds shifted, lights sliding across the glass table and up along the pen still suspended between decision and hesitation. And for the first time since she spoke, something changed, not in the room, not in the others, but in him. The pen didn't move forward. It didn't sign. It simply stayed there. The silence did not break all at once. It thinned slowly, like tension leaking out of a sealed room that no one wanted to admit had been under pressure the entire time. Ava could feel it in the subtle shifts around her, a chair adjusting half an inch, a throat clearing that sounded louder than it should, the faint rustle of a suit sleeve against polished glass. No one told her to sit. No one told her to leave either. That was new. 8 hours earlier, she had entered the building through the service elevator on the west side, the one that hummed louder than the others and smelled faintly of industrial cleaner and metal. She had worn the same navy hoodie she always wore on early shifts, sleeves pushed just past her wrists, her hair tied back tight enough to stay out of her face while she worked. Her mother had been 2 floors below her, vacuuming a corridor lined with offices that overlooked the river, moving in steady, practiced lines that made the work almost invisible to anyone passing by. Ava had learned early that invisibility was not just something given, it was something maintained. Keep your head down. Do not interrupt. Do not ask questions that make people uncomfortable. That was how you kept the job. That was how you kept the lights on. But that morning, something had slipped. It was small, almost nothing. A folder left slightly open in the copier tray on the 27th floor, its top page marked in bold letters, Final Agreement Draft. Most people would have walked past it. Ava had not. She had paused, just for a second, her hand still holding a cloth damp with glass cleaner, her eyes catching on a paragraph that did not read the way it should. She did not open it fully at first. She did not need to. Years of reading things she was never assigned to read had trained her to recognize patterns, to notice when language bent just enough to hide something underneath. She had seen contracts before, not in rooms like this, but on borrowed library computers, in business case studies, in articles she bookmarked and reread late at night when the apartment was quiet and the city outside felt distant. She had once enrolled in a community college finance program 3 miles from where she grew up, taking the bus every morning at 6:15, sitting in the front row, writing everything down like it might disappear if she did not. She had lasted 2 semesters before her mother's health started to slip, before the bills began stacking higher than the time she could afford to spend in a classroom. She never said she dropped out. She just stopped going. Back in the present, her eyes stayed fixed on the same line she had memorized hours earlier. The clause that shifted responsibility so subtly, it almost looked standard, almost. Around the table, the executives had stopped smiling now, not because they believed her, but because something in her tone had not matched what they expected. It was not defensive. It was not uncertain. It was calm in a way that did not belong to someone in her position. Richard's fingers tightened slightly around the pen, not enough to snap it, but enough to leave a faint impression along the matte black surface. He glanced down again, slower this time, as if the page in front of him had changed without permission. Ava took a single step closer to the table, not invading, just enough to make sure her voice did not have to travel. The city light shifted again across the glass, catching the edge of the document, illuminating the exact paragraph she had seen before. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Page 17, she said quietly, steady as the hum in the room. 3rd paragraph, subsection C. It does not protect your company. It transfers everything away from it. No one laughed this time. No one interrupted. The room did not freeze again, but it held, suspended between dismissal and something else that had not fully formed yet. And for the first time since she walked in, Ava felt it. Not confidence, not relief, but the precise moment where being invisible was no longer an option. Richard Caldwell did not speak immediately, and that silence carried more weight than any interruption could have. His eyes moved across the page again, slower now, not scanning but tracing, as if each word had to justify its place under his attention. Around him, the room adjusted without meaning to, executives leaning forward by fractions of an inch, their confidence no longer relaxed but sharpened, alert to something they had not prepared for. One man on the left side of the table reached for his tablet, tapping the screen twice before pulling the contract up, his brows knitting together as he scrolled. Another shifted his glasses higher on his nose, lips pressed thin, reading in parallel with a tension that had replaced earlier amusement. Ava remained where she stood, not advancing further, not retreating, her posture steady in a way that did not challenge but did not yield either. The overhead lights reflected in the glass table, creating layered images of documents, hands, and faces that seemed to overlap, as if the room itself was trying to reconcile 2 different realities at once. Richard's thumb rolled slightly against the pen, a controlled motion, the kind that signaled calculation rather than hesitation. Subsection C. He repeated quietly, not to the room, but to himself, his voice lower now, stripped of the earlier authority that filled space without effort. He flipped back 1 page, then forward again, cross-checking, verifying, the rhythm precise and deliberate. No one spoke. The air conditioning continued its steady hum, but it no longer faded into the background. It was present now, a constant reminder of how still everything else had become. Ava could feel her heartbeat, not racing, but firm, grounded, each pulse anchoring her in the moment she had stepped into without permission. She remembered sitting in the back corner of a public library, a cracked vinyl chair under her, a borrowed laptop balanced on a table that wobbled if she leaned too hard. She had read about deals like this, about structures that looked balanced until they were tested, about language designed to pass unnoticed until it was too late. She had learned to slow down when others rushed, to question when things looked too clean, too perfect. That instinct had not left her. It had only been waiting. That is standard indemnity language. One of the partners finally said, his voice controlled but edged with insistence, as if saying it firmly enough could restore the room to what it had been before. He glanced toward Richard, seeking confirmation, reinforcement, something to re-establish the familiar hierarchy. Richard did not look at him. His gaze remained on the page, his expression tightening almost imperceptibly as he reached the exact line Ava had pointed out. The partner continued, more forcefully now. "It protects us in the event of..." "No," Richard said, not loudly, but with a clarity that cut through the sentence before it could finish. The words settled into the room with a different kind of finality. He tapped the clause once with the tip of his pen, not a gesture of emphasis, but of recognition. "It does not." The shift was immediate, not dramatic, but undeniable. Shoulders that had been squared with confidence adjusted, eyes that had dismissed now reconsidered, and the space Ava occupied no longer felt peripheral. Richard leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze lifting from the document for the first time with full attention directed at her. It was not the dismissive glance from before. It was focused, measuring, something closer to respect than skepticism, though not fully there yet. "Explain it," he said, his tone even, controlled, but no longer indifferent. The room followed his lead, every pair of eyes turning toward Ava again, but this time without laughter, without the easy certainty of dismissal. The skyline behind the glass shifted as clouds moved across the sun, casting a softer light into the room, and in that subtle change, the distance between where Ava had been standing in their perception and where she stood now narrowed into something that could no longer be ignored. No one expected her to actually answer. The request hung in the air for a fraction of a second longer than it should have, as if the room itself needed time to adjust to the idea that the floor had just been handed over to someone who had never been invited to speak. Ava inhaled once, steady and controlled, her eyes dropping briefly to the document before lifting again, not to challenge, but to clarify. "It is written to look like protection," she began, her voice even, each word placed carefully, not rushed, not uncertain. But the phrasing shifts the burden after execution, not before. A faint crease formed between the brows of the partner who had spoken earlier. Ava took one small step closer to the edge of the table, close enough now that the reflection of the text aligned with her line of sight. "If the deal fails due to any compliance issue or any post-merger liability, the responsibility defaults to your company entirely. There is no shared exposure. There is no cap." A few fingers tightened around pens. Someone stopped scrolling. Ava continued, not raising her voice, but letting the structure speak for itself. "The language in subsection C overrides the earlier limitation clause in section 12. It sounds like it reinforces it, but it actually cancels it out." Quietly, the words settled into the room with a different weight. Quietly, that was how it had been designed. That was why it had almost worked. Richard's gaze sharpened, not at her, but at the connection she had just drawn. He flipped back to section 12, his movements now quicker, more focused, the earlier hesitation replaced by intent. The pages made a soft, crisp sound against the glass as they turned. Ava did not fill the silence. She did not need to. The explanation had already done what it needed to do. Across the table, the same partner leaned forward, his earlier confidence now edged with something less certain. "That interpretation assumes," he started, but his voice did not carry the same authority as before. Ava did not interrupt him. She simply waited, her presence no longer something that could be dismissed mid-sentence. Richard stopped turning pages. His pen hovered once more, but this time not above the signature line. It rested lightly against the margin of the clause she had identified. He read it again, slower than before, and then once more, as if repetition might change the outcome. It did not. The skyline outside shifted again, clouds moving across the sun, softening the light that filtered into the room. It reflected off the glass table, illuminating the text in a way that made the words feel less hidden, less protected by complexity. Richard's jaw tightened slightly, a subtle shift, but enough to signal recognition. Not surprise. Recognition. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking softly under the change in weight, and for a brief moment, he closed the folder halfway, not to dismiss it, but to pause the decision it represented. Around him, no one spoke. No one offered correction. The structure of the room had changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the quiet way that power shifts when certainty is is replaced with doubt. Richard looked up at Ava again, fully this time, his expression no longer distant, no longer filtered through assumption. "You are saying," he said slowly, each word deliberate, "that if I sign this, every risk becomes mine." Ava met his gaze, steady, without hesitation. "Yes, sir," she replied, calm as before. "Every single one." The room did not react immediately. It held, suspended between what had been assumed and what had just been revealed. And in that space, the distance between a signature and a mistake had never felt smaller. The room did not erupt. It tightened, like a structure bracing under pressure that no one had planned for. The partner who had defended the clause earlier leaned forward again, but this time there was no ease in his posture, no polished confidence to carry his words. "That is a very bold interpretation," he said, his voice controlled, but thinner now, stretched across something fragile. "These agreements go through multiple legal reviews." Ava did not respond to the tone. She had heard it before, not in rooms like this, but in classrooms where her answers had been questioned not because they were wrong, but because they came from her. She kept her eyes on Richard, not out of defiance, but because he was the only one in the room whose decision mattered now. "It is not interpretation," she said quietly, her voice steady. "It is structure. The wording changes where the risk lands after the deal closes. It is not shared. It is transferred." A faint exhale moved across the table, someone leaning back, another shifting forward, the balance of the room no longer settled. Richard's fingers pressed slightly harder against the pen, then eased, the motion small but deliberate, like someone recalibrating in real time. He flipped the page again, this time slower, tracing the earlier limitation clause Ava had mentioned, his eyes moving line by line, not trusting memory, not trusting assumption. The partner spoke again, quicker now, as if speed could regain control. "Even if there is exposure, it is standard risk in transactions of this size. We are talking about a deal worth over $400 million. There is always, not like this," Ava said, not interrupting, but not waiting either. Her voice did not rise, but it held, firm enough to exist alongside his. "This is not shared risk. This is one-sided liability disguised as mutual protection." The words settled heavier than before. Around the table, screens stopped scrolling. A woman near the far end adjusted her glasses and leaned closer to her tablet, her expression tightening as she reached the same section. Another executive lowered his pen completely, no longer pretending to take notes. The room was no longer debating her presence. It was responding to what she had revealed. Richard closed the folder halfway again, this time more deliberately, his hand resting on top of it, anchoring the document as if it might shift under him. He did not look at the partner who had been speaking. He did not ask for confirmation. He did not delegate the decision. Instead, he asked a different question, one that redirected the entire room. "Who drafted this clause?" he said, his voice calm, but carrying a sharper edge than before. The partner hesitated, just for a fraction of a second too long. "It came from Von Global's legal team," he replied, carefully. The name hung in the air, familiar, trusted, repeated in meetings like this for years without question. Richard's gaze did not soften. If anything, it narrowed, not in anger, but in focus. Ava felt the shift before anyone said it out loud. This was no longer about whether she was right. It was about what that meant. The air in the room felt cooler now, the steady hum of the system overhead more noticeable against the quiet that had settled deeper than before. Ava's hands remained still at her sides, her posture unchanged, but inside, she could feel the weight of the moment pressing forward, not as fear, but as consequence. She had stepped into a space she was never meant to occupy, and now the room could not return to what it had been before she spoke. Richard lifted the pen again, but not toward the signature line. He turned it slowly between his fingers, the black surface catching the light as it rotated, reflecting a decision that had not yet been spoken but was already taking shape. And for the first time since the meeting began, the authority in the room did not feel absolute. It felt questioned. The room did not move forward. It settled into something quieter, heavier, like a pause that no one wanted to interrupt, because everyone understood that whatever came next would not be small. The glass walls held the city outside in a muted reflection, sunlight diffused through slow-moving clouds, softening the sharp edges of the skyline into something almost distant. Inside, the air felt still, not empty, but full in a way that made even the smallest movement noticeable. Richard Caldwell did not speak. He did not look at anyone else. His hand rested on the closed folder, fingers spread lightly across the surface as if measuring its weight, not in pounds, but in consequence. The pen remained between his fingers, no longer a tool, but a question. Ava stood where she had been, her shoulders relaxed but grounded, her breathing steady, the faint rise and fall of it the only movement she allowed herself. She could feel the cool air against her skin, hear the quiet hum of the building systems running behind the walls, the kind of sound most people forgot existed until silence made it visible again. No one asked her to leave. No one challenged her now. The earlier tension had not disappeared. It had transformed, stretched into a different kind of awareness that settled across every person at the table. One executive lowered his gaze to the contract again, slower this time, as if reading it for the first time without assumption. Another leaned back, fingers pressed together under his chin, eyes fixed on nothing in particular, processing something that had already shifted beyond his control. Ava's mind did not race. It did not jump ahead. It stayed in the moment, anchored to the quiet certainty that had carried her this far. She remembered the nights she had spent reading under dim apartment lights. The sound of traffic outside her window, the weight of exhaustion balanced against the need to understand things no one had asked her to understand. Those moments had never felt important to anyone else. But they had built something in her, something that did not depend on permission. Richard finally moved, but only slightly, his thumb brushing once along the edge of the folder before lifting the pen again. He did not bring it down. He did not sign. Instead, he held it just above the paper, the distance between ink and signature measured in less than an inch, but carrying the weight of millions of dollars, of reputations, of trust that now felt less certain than it had an hour ago. The light shifted again, a narrow beam slipping through the clouds and stretching across the table, catching the pen, the paper, and the space between them. It illuminated the exact point where decision would have happened, where it almost had. Ava watched it without moving, without speaking, her presence no longer an intrusion, but part of the equation itself. Richard exhaled slowly, not sharply, not dramatically, but in a way that released something held tight beneath the surface. The sound was quiet, but in the stillness, it carried. His hand lowered just a fraction, then stopped. The pen did not touch the page. It hovered, suspended, as if waiting for a different outcome than the one it had been meant to complete. And in that quiet, in that single moment where nothing happened, everything had already begun to change. Richard's hand did not tremble, but it did not move forward either, and that difference, subtle as it was, shifted something deeper than any spoken decision could have. The pen remained suspended above the page, the space between intention and action now filled with something heavier than certainty. His eyes did not return to the contract this time. They lifted, slowly, deliberately, and settled on Ava in a way that acknowledged not just her presence, but her impact. Around the table, the stillness tightened again, not with tension, but with anticipation, as if everyone understood they were no longer waiting for a signature, but for a realization to be spoken out loud. Richard lowered the pen, not onto the paper, but onto the glass surface beside the folder, the soft click echoing more clearly than it should have in the quiet room. That sound marked the moment more than any words could have. He leaned back slightly, his posture no longer angled toward completion, but toward reconsideration. "This deal," he said, his voice calm but stripped of its earlier finality, was presented as balanced. No one responded. No one agreed. The statement did not invite confirmation. It carried its own weight. He opened the folder again, but this time not to sign, not to skim, but to examine, his fingers turning the pages with a slower, more deliberate rhythm, as if each section needed to prove itself under a new standard. "How long has this been in review?" he asked, not looking up. A voice answered, cautious now, measured. 3 weeks. Richard paused, his gaze fixed on the text, the timeline settling into place alongside what had just been uncovered. 3 weeks of review. 3 weeks of assumption. 3 weeks where no one had stopped to question what had been written clearly enough to be understood, but quietly enough to be ignored. Ava felt the shift fully now, not just in posture, not just in tone, but in direction. The room was no longer moving toward agreement. It was moving toward accountability. Richard closed the folder again, more firmly this time, his hand resting on top of it with a finality that had nothing to do with signing. He looked up once more, directly at Ava, his expression no longer distant, no longer filtered through hierarchy. It was clear, focused, and for the first time, unguarded in a way that suggested recognition had replaced assumption. "You stopped this," he said, not as a question, not as praise, but as a statement of fact. Ava did not react outwardly. She did not step forward. She did not lower her gaze. "I just read it," she replied, her voice quiet, steady, unchanged. The simplicity of the answer settled into the room, heavier than anything else that had been said. Around the table, no one interrupted. No one attempted to reclaim control. The earlier voices, the ones that had questioned her presence, had gone silent, replaced by something more careful, more aware. Richard exhaled again, slower this time, his shoulders easing back just enough to signal that the decision he had almost made no longer held authority over the moment. He turned the pen once between his fingers, then set it down. Fully, away from the document, separating it from the action it had nearly completed. The distance was small, measured in inches, but it carried the weight of everything that had just changed. The skyline outside shifted again, light breaking through the clouds in a softer, warmer tone that reflected across the glass table, across the closed folder, across the space where a signature had almost existed. And in that quiet, undeniable shift, the truth was no longer hidden in the fine print. It was sitting in the room, acknowledged, impossible to ignore, and it had come from the one voice no one had expected to hear. No one spoke for several seconds after his words settled, and in that silence, something unfamiliar moved through the room, not discomfort, not resistance, but a quiet recognition that the balance had shifted in a way no one could reverse. Richard Caldwell did not look away from Ava. He did not return to the document. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table, bringing himself closer to the same level where her voice had entered the conversation. It was a small movement, almost unnoticeable to anyone not watching carefully, but it carried a meaning that no one in the room could ignore. "What is your name?" he asked, his tone steady, stripped of the distance that had defined it earlier. Ava paused for just a fraction of a second, not because she did not know the answer, but because the question itself marked a line that had not existed before. "Ava Johnson," she replied, her voice calm, unchanged, the same quiet strength that had carried her through every word she had spoken. Richard nodded once, slowly, as if placing that name into a space it had not been allowed to occupy until now. Around the table, a few executives shifted again, but this time not out of dismissal or impatience, but out of adjustment, recalibrating to a reality that no longer aligned with their earlier assumptions. The partner who had defended the clause earlier lowered his gaze to the table, his fingers now still, no longer tapping, no longer signaling confidence. Richard reached for the folder again, but instead of opening it, he slid it a few inches away from himself, creating a visible distance between his authority and the decision he had almost finalized. The movement was quiet, but it spoke clearly. "We are not signing this today," he said, not raising his voice, not needing to. The words settled across the table with a calm finality that redirected everything at once. No one argued. No one questioned. The decision did not feel abrupt. It felt necessary. Richard turned his head slightly, addressing the room without losing the focus he had placed on Ava. "I want a full review of every clause in this agreement, independent verification, and I want to know exactly how this passed through 3 weeks of review without being flagged." His voice remained even, but there was a firmness beneath it now, not driven by anger, but by clarity. The room responded immediately, not with words, but with motion, screens lighting up again, notes being taken with a different urgency, conversations beginning in low, controlled tones that carried none of the earlier ease. Ava remained still, her hands relaxed at her sides, her presence no longer questioned, no longer peripheral. Richard looked back at her, and for a brief moment, something softened in his expression, not weakness, not uncertainty, but recognition, the kind that comes when a truth arrives from a place no one expected. You said you read it, he said, his tone quieter now, more personal than before. Ava nodded once. Yes, sir. He studied her for a second longer, as if measuring something beyond what had already been proven. You saw what everyone else missed. Ava did not smile. She did not shift. I just paid attention, she replied, her voice as steady as it had been from the beginning. The simplicity of it lingered in the air, cutting through the complexity of everything that had been discussed. Richard exhaled slowly, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging not just her answer, but the truth within it. The light outside the windows shifted again, warmer now, reflecting across the glass table in softer tones, no longer sharp, no longer cold. And in that quiet shift, the room no longer felt like a place where power spoke the loudest. It felt like a place where, for once, it had listened. The meeting did not end with a bang or a formal closing statement. It dissolved slowly, like tension releasing from a structure that had held more than it was built to carry. Chairs shifted back with soft movements, screens dimmed one by one, and conversations that had once filled the room with confidence now stayed low, measured, careful. No one laughed. No one rushed. The glass doors opened quietly, and people began to step out in small groups, their voices barely above a murmur, each of them carrying a different version of what had just happened, but all of them aware that something fundamental had changed. Ava did not move right away. She stood where she had been, her eyes no longer fixed on the contract, but resting somewhere just beyond it, as if the moment had not fully settled yet. The light from outside stretched across the table, warmer now, softer, touching the surface where the pen still lay untouched beside the folder that would not be signed. Richard remained seated for a few seconds longer than anyone else, his hand resting near the edge of the table, his gaze following the space where Ava stood without calling her back, without commanding attention, simply observing. When he finally stood, the motion was unhurried, controlled, but different from the authority that had defined him at the beginning of the meeting. It was quieter, more deliberate, as if something in him had shifted from certainty to awareness. Ava turned slightly, her body angling toward the exit, the badge at her chest catching the light again, the name Johnson clear against the fabric. She began to walk, not quickly, not hesitating, each step measured, grounded, the same way she had stood, the same way she had spoken. No one stopped her. No one questioned her now. The hallway outside felt cooler, the air moving gently through the space, carrying the faint sounds of the building beyond the boardroom walls, distant voices, the soft hum of elevators, the rhythm of a place that continued even when something inside it had changed. Behind her, the glass doors closed with a quiet seal, separating the room from the corridor, but not erasing what had happened inside. Richard stepped forward just enough to reach the threshold, his hand resting briefly against the edge of the door, his eyes still on her as she moved away. He did not call her name. He did not offer anything immediate, no position, no reward, no words to reshape the moment into something simpler. Instead, he watched, his expression calm, reflective, as if understanding that what she had done did not belong to him to define. Ava continued down the hallway, the polished floor reflecting her movement in faint, shifting light, her figure steady, unhurried, not looking back. The building around her remained the same walls, the same offices, the same spaces she had moved through unseen just hours earlier. But the silence that followed her felt different now, not empty, not dismissive, but aware. Inside the boardroom, the folder remained closed, the pen set aside, the decision paused not by force, but by truth that had been spoken clearly enough to be heard. And in that quiet separation between what almost happened and what did not, there was no applause, no declaration, no final statement to explain it. There was only the absence of a signature, the presence of a name that had been seen, and the stillness of a moment where power had listened, and for once, it had changed.